Winston Churchill was born in November 30, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire, England, and he died in January 24, 1965, London. He was a British statesman, orator, and author who as Prime Minister, 1940–45, 1951–55, rallied the British people during World War II and led his country from the brink of defeat to victory. Churchill as a child. Political office ran in his blood. His grandfather, John Spencer Churchill, had been a member of Parliament serving under Benjamin Disraeli, whilst his father Lord Randolph Churchill was MP for Woodstock. On his mother's side he was of American descent. Jenny Jerome was a beautiful lady from a wealthy family who had caught Randolph's eye in August 1873. 3 days later they were engaged. As they say, the rest is history. A young Winston Churchill led quite a dour life early on, unhappy in childhood and failing to get the grades at Harrow. His interest in the military proved to be his saving grace. His father decided it would be a good idea for him to enter the army as a profession, and after the third attempt he passed the necessary exams and entered what is now Sandhurst Academy. Whilst at military college, he managed to acquire the skills and knowledge to graduate in the top 20 of around 130 pupils in the class. In 1895 his father sadly passed away, and a young Winston joined the Royal Cavalry. Whilst on leave, he entered the world of journalism, which found him reporting on the Cuban War of Independence from Spain. By the following year he found himself back in the regiment and travelling to India, where he worked as both a soldier and journalist. He remained posted there for around 19 months, in which time he took part in expeditions to Hyderabad and the northwest frontier. As part of the British Army and working as a correspondent reporting for newspapers back in Britain, he travelled to India, Sudan and South Africa, documenting the unfolding events via newspaper articles and later turning some of the accounts into successful books. After a sensational rise to prominence in national politics before World War I, Churchill acquired a reputation for erratic judgment in the war itself and in the decade that followed. Politically suspect in consequence, he was a lonely figure until his response to Adolf Hitler's challenge brought him to leadership of a national coalition in 1940. With Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, he then shaped Allied strategy in World War II, and after the breakdown of the alliance he alerted the West to the expansionist threat of the Soviet Union. He led the Conservative Party back to office in 1951 and remained Prime Minister until 1955, when ill health forced his resignation. In Churchill's veins ran the blood of both of the English-speaking peoples whose unity in peace and war it was to be a constant purpose of his to promote. Through his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, the meteoric Tory politician, he was directly descended from John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, the hero of the wars against Louis XIV of France in the early 18th century. His mother, Jenny Jerome, a noted beauty, was the daughter of a New York financier and horse racing enthusiast, Leonard W. Jerome. The young Churchill passed an unhappy and sadly neglected childhood, redeemed only by the affection of Mrs. Everest, his devoted nurse. At Harrow, his conspicuously poor academic record seemingly justified his father's decision to enter him into an army career. It was only at the third attempt that he managed to pass the entrance examination at Sandhurst, but once admitted to the military academy, he applied himself seriously and passed out, graduated 20th in a class of 130. In 1895, the year of his father's tragic death, he entered the 4th Hussars. Initially the only prospect of action was in Cuba, where he spent a couple of months of leave reporting the Cuban War of Independence from Spain for the Daily Graphic, London. In 1896 his regiment went to India, where he saw service as both soldier and journalist on the northwest frontier, 1897. Expanded as the story of the Malakand Field Force, 1898. His dispatches attracted such wide attention as to launch him on the career of authorship that he intermittently pursued throughout his life. In 1897–98, he wrote Savrola, 1900, a Ruritanian romance, and got himself attached to Lord Kitchener's Nile Expeditionary Force in the same dual role of soldier and correspondent. The River War, 1899, brilliantly describes the campaign. His political career before 1939. The 5 years after Sandhurst saw Churchill's interests expand and mature. He relieved the tedium of army life in India by a program of reading designed to repair the deficiencies of Harrow and Sandhurst, and in 1899 he resigned his commission to enter politics and make a living by his pen. He first stood as a Conservative at Oldham, where he lost a by-election by a narrow margin, but found quick solace in reporting the South African War for the Morning Post, London. Within a month after his arrival in South Africa, he had won fame for his part in rescuing an armoured train ambushed by Boers, though at the price of himself being taken prisoner. But this fame was redoubled when less than a month later he escaped from military prison. Returning to Britain a military hero, he laid siege again to Oldham in the election of 1900. Churchill succeeded in winning by a margin as narrow as that of his previous failure. But he was now in Parliament and, fortified by the £10,000 his writings and lecture tours had earned for him, was in a position to make his own way in politics. A self-assurance redeemed from arrogance only by a kind of boyish charm made Churchill from the first a notable House of Commons figure, but a speech defect, which he never wholly lost, combined with a certain psychological inhibition to prevent him from immediately becoming a master of debate. He excelled in the set speech, on which he always spent enormous pains, rather than in the impromptu. Lord Balfour, the Conservative leader, said of him that he carried heavy but not very mobile guns. In matter as in style he modelled himself on his father, as his admirable biography, Lord Randolph Churchill, 1906, revised edition 1952, makes evident, and from the first he wore his Toryism with a difference, advocating a fair, negotiated peace for the Boers and deploring military mismanagement and extravagance. Churchill as a Liberal minister. In 1904 the Conservative government found itself impaled on a dilemma by Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain's open advocacy of a tariff. Churchill, a convinced free trader, helped to found the Free Food League. He was disavowed by his constituents and became increasingly alienated from his party. In 1904 he joined the Liberals and won renown for the audacity of his attacks on Chamberlain and Balfour. The radical elements in his political makeup came to the surface under the influence of two colleagues in particular, John Morley, a political legatee of W. E. Gladstone, and David Lloyd George, the rising Welsh orator and firebrand. In the ensuing general election in 1906, he secured a notable victory in Manchester, and began his ministerial career in the new Liberal government as Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies. He soon gained credit for his able defense of the policy of conciliation and self-government in South Africa. When the ministry was reconstructed under Prime Minister Herbert H. Asquith in 1908, Churchill was promoted to President of the Board of Trade, with a seat in the cabinet. Defeated at the ensuing by-election in Manchester, he won an election at Dundee. In the same year he married the beautiful Clementine Hosier. It was a marriage of unbroken affection that provided a secure and happy background for his turbulent career. At the Board of Trade, Churchill emerged as a leader in the movement of liberalism away from laissez-faire toward social reform. He completed the work begun by his predecessor, Lloyd George, on the bill imposing an 8-hour maximum day for miners. He himself was responsible for attacking the evils of sweated labor by setting up trade boards with power to fix minimum wages and for combating unemployment by instituting state-run labor exchanges. When this liberal program necessitated high taxation, which in turn provoked the House of Lords to the revolutionary step of rejecting the budget of 1909, Churchill was Lloyd George's closest ally in developing the provocative strategy designed to clip the wings of the upper chamber. Churchill became president of the Budget League, and his oratorical broadsides at the House of Lords were as lively and devastating as Lloyd George's own. Indeed, Churchill, as an alleged traitor to his class, earned the lion's share of Tory animosity. His campaigning in the two general elections of 1910 and in the House of Commons during the passage of the Parliament Act of 1911, which curbed the House of Lords' powers, won him wide popular acclaim. In the cabinet, his reward was promotion to the office of Home Secretary. Here, despite substantial achievements in prison reform, he had to devote himself principally to coping with a sweeping wave of industrial unrest and violent strikes. Upon occasion his relish for dramatic action led him beyond the limits of his proper role as the guarantor of public order. For this he paid a heavy price in incurring the long-standing suspicion of organized labor. In 1911, the provocative German action in sending a gunboat to Agadir, the Moroccan port to which France had claims, convinced Churchill that in any major Franco-German conflict Britain would have to be at France's side. When transferred to the Admiralty in October 1911, he went to work with a conviction of the need to bring the Navy to a pitch of instant readiness. His first task was the creation of a naval war staff. To help Britain's lead over steadily mounting German naval power, Churchill successfully campaigned in the cabinet for the largest naval expenditure in British history. Despite his inherited Tory views on Ireland, he wholeheartedly embraced the liberal policy of Home Rule, moving the second reading of the Irish Home Rule Bill of 1912 and campaigning for it in the teeth of Unionist opposition. Although, through his friendship with F. E. Smith, later 1st Earl of Birkenhead, and Austen Chamberlain, he did much to arrange the compromise by which Ulster was to be excluded from the immediate effect of the bill, no member of the government was more bitterly abused, by Tories as a renegade and by extreme Home Rulers as a defector. During World War I, war came as no surprise to Churchill. He had already held a test naval mobilization. Of all the cabinet ministers, he was the most insistent on the need to resist Germany. On August 2, 1914, on his own responsibility, he ordered the naval mobilization that guaranteed complete readiness when war was declared. The war called out all of Churchill's energies. In October 1914, when Antwerp was falling, he characteristically rushed in person to organize its defense. When it fell, the public saw only a disillusioning defeat, but in fact the prolongation of its resistance for almost a week enabled the Belgian army to escape and the crucial Channel ports to be saved. At the Admiralty, Churchill's partnership with Admiral Sir John Fisher, the First Sea Lord, was productive both of dynamism and of dissension. In 1915, when Churchill became an enthusiast for the Dardanelles expedition as a way out of the costly stalemate on the Western Front, he had to proceed against Fisher's disapproval. The campaign aimed at forcing the Straits and opening up direct communications with Russia. When the naval attack failed and was called off on the spot by Admiral J. M. de Robeck, the Admiralty War Group and Asquith both supported de Robeck rather than Churchill. Churchill came under heavy political attack, which intensified when Fisher resigned. Preoccupied with departmental affairs, Churchill was quite unprepared for the storm that broke about his ears. He had no part at all in the maneuvers that produced the first coalition government and was powerless when the Conservatives, with the sole exception of Sir William Maxwell Aitken, soon Lord Beaverbrook, insisted on his being demoted from the Admiralty to the Duchy of Lancaster. There he was given special responsibility for the Gallipoli campaign, a land assault at the Straits, without, however, any powers of direction. Reinforcements were too few and too late. The campaign failed and casualties were heavy. Evacuation was ordered in the autumn. In November 1915, Churchill resigned from the government and returned to soldiering, seeing active service in France as Lieutenant Colonel of the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers. Although he entered the service with zest, army life did not give full scope for his talents. In June 1916, when his battalion was merged, he did not seek another command but instead returned to Parliament as a private member. He was not involved in the intrigues that led to the formation of a coalition government under Lloyd George, and it was not until 1917 that the Conservatives would consider his inclusion in the government. In March 1917, the publication of the Dardanelles Commission report demonstrated that he was at least no more to blame for the fiasco than his colleagues. Even so, Churchill's appointment as Minister of Munitions in July 1917 was made in the face of a storm of Tory protest. Excluded from the cabinet, Churchill's role was almost entirely administrative, but his dynamic energies thrown behind the development and production of the tank, which he had initiated at the Admiralty, greatly speeded up the use of the weapon that broke through the deadlock on the Western Front. Paradoxically, it was not until the war was over that Churchill returned to a service department. In January 1919 he became Secretary of War. As such, he presided with surprising zeal over the cutting of military expenditure. The major preoccupation of his tenure in the War Office was, however, the Allied intervention in Russia. Churchill, passionately anti-Bolshevik, secured from a divided and loosely organized cabinet an intensification and prolongation of the British involvement beyond the wishes of any major group in Parliament or the nation. and in the face of the bitter hostility of Labour. And in 1920, after the last British forces had been withdrawn, Churchill was instrumental in having arms sent to the Poles when they invaded the Ukraine. In 1921, Churchill moved to the Colonial Office, where his principal concern was with the mandated territories in the Middle East. For the costly British forces in the area, he substituted a reliance on the Air Force and the establishment of rulers congenial to British interests. For this settlement of Arab affairs he relied heavily on the advice of T. E. Lawrence. For Palestine, where he inherited conflicting pledges to Jews and Arabs, he produced in 1922 the White Paper that confirmed Palestine as a Jewish national home while recognizing continuing Arab rights. Churchill never had departmental responsibility for Ireland, but he progressed from an initial belief in firm, even ruthless maintenance of British rule to an active role in the negotiations that led to the Irish Treaty of 1921. Subsequently, he gave full support to the new Irish government. In the autumn of 1922, the insurgent Turks appeared to be moving toward a forcible reoccupation of the Dardanelles neutral zone, which was protected by a small British force at Chanak, now Canakkale. Churchill was foremost in urging a firm stand against them, but the handling of the issue by the cabinet gave the public impression that a major war was being risked for an inadequate cause and on insufficient consideration. A political debacle ensued that brought the shaky coalition government down in ruins, with Churchill as one of the worst casualties. Gripped by a sudden attack of appendicitis, he was not able to appear in public until 2 days before the election, and then only in a wheelchair. He was defeated humiliatingly by more than 10,000 votes. He thus found himself, as he said, all at once without an office, without a seat, without a party, and even without an appendix. In 1922-29 Churchill was in and out of office. In convalescence and political impotence, Churchill turned to his brush and his pen. His painting never rose above the level of a gifted amateur's, but his writing once again provided him with the financial base his independent brand of politics required. His autobiographical history of the war, The World Crisis, netted him the £20,000 with which he purchased Chartwell, henceforth his country home in Kent. When he returned to politics it was as a crusading anti-socialist, but in 1923, when Stanley Baldwin was leading the Conservatives on a protectionist program, Churchill stood, at Leicester, as a liberal free trader. He lost by approximately 4,000 votes. Asquith's decision in 1924 to support a minority Labour government moved Churchill farther to the right. He stood as an independent anti-socialist in a by-election in the Abbey division of Westminster. Although opposed by an official Conservative candidate, who defeated him by a hairbreadth of 43 votes, Churchill managed to avoid alienating the Conservative leadership and indeed won conspicuous support from many prominent figures in the party. In the general election in November 1924, he won an easy victory at Epping under the thinly disguised Conservative label of constitutionalist. Baldwin, free of his flirtation with protectionism, offered Churchill, the constitutionalist free trader, the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer. Surprised, Churchill accepted. Dumbfounded, the country interpreted it as a move to absorb into the party all the right-of-centre elements of the former coalition. In the 5 years that followed, Churchill's early liberalism survived only in the form of advocacy of rigid laissez-faire economics. For the rest he appeared, repeatedly, as the leader of the diehards. He had no natural gift for financial administration, and though the noted economist John Maynard Keynes criticized him unsparingly, most of the advice he received was orthodox and harmful. His first move was to restore the gold standard, a disastrous measure, from which flowed deflation, unemployment, and the miners' strike that led to the general strike of 1926. Churchill offered no remedy except the cultivation of strict economy, extending even to the armed services. Churchill viewed the general strike as a quasi-revolutionary measure, and was foremost in resisting a negotiated settlement. He leaped at the opportunity of editing the British Gazette, an emergency official newspaper, which he filled with bombastic and frequently inflammatory propaganda. The one relic of his earlier radicalism was his partnership with Neville Chamberlain as Minister of Health in the cautious expansion of social services, mainly in the provision of widows' pensions. In 1929, when the government fell, Churchill, who would have liked a Tory Liberal reunion, deplored Baldwin's decision to accept a minority Labour government. The next year, an open rift developed between the two men. On Baldwin's endorsement of a round-table conference with Indian leaders, Churchill resigned from the shadow cabinet and threw himself into a passionate, at times almost hysterical campaign against the Government of India Bill, 1935, designed to give India Dominion status. Exclusion from office, 1929–39. Thus, when in 1931 the national government was formed, Churchill, though a supporter, had no hand in its establishment or place in its councils. He had arrived at a point where, for all his abilities, he was distrusted by every party. He was thought to lack judgment and stability and was regarded as a guerrilla fighter impatient of discipline. He was considered a clever man who associated too much with clever men, Birkenhead, Beaverbrook, Lloyd George, and who despised the necessary humdrum associations and compromises of practical politics. In this situation he found relief, as well as profit, in his pen writing in Marlborough. His Life and Times, a massive rehabilitation of his ancestor against the criticisms of the 19th-century historian Thomas Babington Macaulay. But overriding the past and transcending his worries about India was a mounting anxiety about the growing menace of Hitler's Germany. Before a supine government and a doubting opposition, Churchill persistently argued the case for taking the German threat seriously and for the need to prevent the Luftwaffe from securing parity with the Royal Air Force. In this he was supported by a small but devoted personal following, in particular the gifted, curmudgeonly Oxford physics professor Frederick A. Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, who enabled him to build up at Chartwell a private intelligence centre the information of which was often superior to that of the government. When Baldwin became Prime Minister in 1935, he persisted in excluding Churchill from office but gave him the exceptional privilege of membership in the Secret Committee on Air Defence Research, thus enabling him to work on some vital national problems. But Churchill had little success in his efforts to impart urgency to Baldwin's administration. The crisis that developed when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935 found Churchill ill-prepared, divided between a desire to build up the League of Nations around the concept of collective security and the fear that collective action would drive Benito Mussolini into the arms of Hitler. The Spanish Civil War, 1936–39, found him convinced of the virtues of non-intervention, first as a supporter and later as a critic of Francisco Franco. Such vagaries of judgment in fact reflected the overwhelming priority he accorded to one issue, the containment of German aggressiveness. At home there was one grievous, characteristic romantic misreading of the political and public mood, when in Edward VIII's abdication crisis of 1936, he vainly opposed Baldwin by a public championing of the king's cause. When Neville Chamberlain succeeded Baldwin, the gulf between the Cassandra-like Churchill and the Conservative leaders widened. Repeatedly the accuracy of Churchill's information on Germany's aggressive plans and progress was confirmed by events. Repeatedly his warnings were ignored. Yet his handful of followers remained small. Politically, Chamberlain felt secure in ignoring them. As German pressure mounted on Czechoslovakia, Churchill without success urged the government to effect a joint declaration of purpose by Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. When the Munich Agreement with Hitler was made in September 1938, sacrificing Czechoslovakia to the Nazis, Churchill laid bare its implications, insisting that it represented a total and unmitigated defeat. In March 1939 Churchill and his group pressed for a truly national coalition, and at last sentiment in the country, recognizing him as the nation's spokesman, began to agitate for his return to office. As long as peace lasted, Chamberlain ignored all such persuasions. In a sense, the whole of Churchill's previous career had been a preparation for wartime leadership. An intense patriot, a romantic believer in his country's greatness and its historic role in Europe, the Empire and the world, a devotee of action who thrived on challenge and crisis, a student, historian and veteran of war, a statesman who was master of the arts of politics, despite or because of long political exile, a man of iron constitution, inexhaustible energy, and total concentration. He seemed to have been nursing all his faculties, so that when the moment came he could lavish them on the salvation of Britain and the values he believed Britain stood for in the world. On September 3, 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, Chamberlain appointed Churchill to his old post in charge of the Admiralty. The signal went out to the fleet. "Winston is back." On September 11, Churchill received a congratulatory note from President Franklin D. Roosevelt and replied over the signature "Naval Person." A memorable correspondence had begun. At once Churchill's restless energy began to be felt throughout the administration, as his ministerial colleagues as well as his own department received the first of those pungent minutes that kept the remotest corners of British wartime government aware that their shortcomings were liable to detection and penalty. All his efforts, however, failed to energize the torpid Anglo-French entente during the so-called phony war, the period of stagnation in the European war before the German seizure of Norway in April 1940. The failure of the Narvik and Trondheim expeditions, dependent as they were on naval support, could not but evoke some memories of the Dardanelles and Gallipoli, so fateful for Churchill's reputation in World War I. This time, however, it was Chamberlain who was blamed, and it was Churchill who endeavored to defend him. Churchill as a Prime Minister. The German invasion of the Low Countries on May 10, 1940, came like a hammer blow on top of the Norwegian fiasco. Chamberlain resigned. He wanted Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, to succeed him, but Halifax wisely declined. It was obvious that Churchill alone could unite and lead the nation, since the Labour Party, for all its old distrust of Churchill's anti-socialism, recognized the depth of his commitment to the defeat of Hitler. A coalition government was formed that included all elements save the far left and right. It was headed by a war cabinet of 5, which included at first both Chamberlain and Halifax, a wise but also magnanimous recognition of the numerical strength of Chamberlainite conservatism, and 2 Labour leaders, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood. The appointment of Ernest Bevin, a tough trade union leader, as Minister of Labour guaranteed cooperation on this vital front. Offers were made to Lloyd George, but he declined them. Churchill himself took, in addition to the leadership of the House of Commons, the Ministry of Defence. The pattern thus set was maintained throughout the war despite many changes of personnel. The cabinet became an agency of swift decision, and the government that it controlled remained representative of all groups and parties. The Prime Minister concentrated on the actual conduct of the war. He delegated freely but also probed and interfered continuously, regarding nothing as too large or too small for his attention. The main function of the chiefs of the armed services became that of containing his great dynamism, as a governor regulates a powerful machine. But, though he prodded and pressed them continuously, he never went against their collective judgment. In all this, Parliament played a vital part. If World War II was strikingly free from the domestic political intrigues of World War I, it was in part because Churchill, while he always dominated Parliament, never neglected it or took it for granted. For him, Parliament was an instrument of public persuasion on which he played like a master, and from which he drew strength and comfort. On May 13, Churchill faced the House of Commons for the first time as Prime Minister. He warned members of the hard road ahead. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat," and committed himself and the nation to all-out war until victory was achieved. Behind this simplicity of aim lay an elaborate strategy to which he adhered with remarkable consistency throughout the war. Hitler's Germany was the enemy. Nothing should distract the entire British people from the task of effecting its defeat. Anyone who shared this goal, even a communist, was an acceptable ally. The indispensable ally in this endeavor, whether formally at war or not, was the United States. The cultivation and maintenance of its support was a central principle of Churchill's thought. Yet whether the United States became a belligerent partner or not, the war must be won without a repetition for Britain of the catastrophic bloodlettings of World War I, and Europe at the conflict's end must be re-established as a viable, self-determining entity, while the Commonwealth should remain as a continuing, if changing, expression of Britain's world role. Provided these essentials were preserved, Churchill, for all his sense of history, was surprisingly willing to sacrifice any national shibboleths, of orthodox economics, of social convention, of military etiquette or tradition, on the altar of victory. Thus, within a couple of weeks of this crusading anti-socialists assuming power, Parliament passed legislation placing all persons, their services and their property at the disposal of the Crown, granting the government in effect the most sweeping emergency powers in modern British history. The effort was designed to match the gravity of the hour. After the Allied defeat and the evacuation of the battered British forces from Dunkirk, Churchill warned Parliament that invasion was a real risk to be met with total and confident defiance. Faced with the swift collapse of France, Churchill made repeated personal visits to the French government in an attempt to keep France in the war, culminating in the celebrated offer of Anglo-French union on June 16, 1940. When all this failed, the Battle of Britain began on July 10. Here Churchill was in his element in the firing line. At fighter headquarters, inspecting coast defenses or anti-aircraft batteries, visiting scenes of bomb damage or victims of the Blitz, smoking his cigar, giving his V sign, or broadcasting frank reports to the nation, laced with touches of grim Churchillian humor and splashed with Churchillian rhetoric. The nation took him to its heart. He and they were one in their finest hour. Other painful and more debatable decisions fell to Churchill. The French fleet was attacked to prevent its surrender intact to Hitler. A heavy commitment was made to the concentrated bombing of Germany. At the height of the invasion threat, a decision was made to reinforce British strength in the eastern Mediterranean. Forces were also sent to Greece, a costly sacrifice. The evacuation of Crete looked like another Gallipoli, and Churchill came under heavy fire in Parliament. In these hard days, the exchange of U.S. overage destroyers for British Caribbean bases and the response, by way of Lend-Lease, to Churchill's boast, "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job," were especially heartening to one who believed in a mixing up of the English-speaking democracies. The unspoken alliance was further cemented in August 1941 by the dramatic meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, which produced the Atlantic Charter, a statement of common principles between the United States and Britain. Formation of the Grand Alliance. When Hitler launched his sudden attack on the Soviet Union, Churchill's response was swift and unequivocal. In a broadcast on June 22, 1941, while refusing to unsay any of his earlier criticisms of communism, he insisted that "the Russian danger is our danger" and pledged aid to the Russian people. Henceforth, it was his policy to construct a grand alliance, incorporating the Soviet Union and the United States. But it took until May 1942 to negotiate a 20-year Anglo-Soviet pact of mutual assistance. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, altered, in Churchill's eyes, the whole prospect of the war. He went at once to Washington, D.C., and, with Roosevelt, hammered out a set of Anglo-American accords. The pooling of both countries' military and economic resources under combined boards and a combined chiefs of staff, the establishment of unity of command in all theaters of war, and agreement on the basic strategy that the defeat of Germany should have priority over the defeat of Japan. The Grand Alliance had now come into being. Churchill could claim to be its principal architect. Safeguarding it was the primary concern of his next 3.5 years. In protecting the alliance, the respect and affection between him and Roosevelt were of crucial importance. They alone enabled Churchill, in the face of relentless pressure from Stalin and ardent advocacy by the U.S. Chiefs of Staff, to secure the rejection of the Second Front in 1942, a project he regarded as premature and costly. In August 1942, Churchill himself flew to Moscow to advise Stalin of the decision, and to bear the brunt of his displeasure. At home, too, he came under fire in 1942. First in January after the reverses in Malaya and the Far East, and later in June when Tobruk in North Africa fell to the Germans, but on neither occasion did his critics muster serious support in Parliament. The year 1942 saw some reconstruction of the cabinet in a leftward direction, which was reflected in the adoption in 1943 of Lord Beveridge's Plan for Comprehensive Social Insurance, endorsed by Churchill as a logical extension of the liberal reforms of 1911. The Allied landings in North Africa necessitated a fresh meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, this time in Casablanca in January 1943. There Churchill argued for an early full-scale attack on the underbelly of the Axis, but won only a grudging acquiescence from the Americans. There too was evolved the unconditional surrender formula of debatable wisdom. Churchill paid the price for his intensive travel, including Tripoli, Turkey, and Algeria, by an attack of pneumonia, for which, however, he allowed only the briefest of respites. In May he was in Washington again, arguing against persistent American aversion to his underbelly strategy, In August he was at Quebec, working out the plans for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel assault. When he learned that the Americans were planning a large-scale invasion of Burma in 1944, his fears that their joint resources would not be adequate for a successful invasion of Normandy were revived. In November 1943 at Cairo, he urged on Roosevelt priority for further Mediterranean offensives, but at Tehran in the first Big Three meeting, he failed to retain Roosevelt's adherence to a completely united Anglo-American front. Roosevelt, though he consulted in private with Stalin, refused to see Churchill alone. For all their friendship, there was also an element of rivalry between the two Western leaders that Stalin skillfully exploited. On the issue of Allied offensive drives into southern Europe, Churchill was outvoted. Throughout the meetings, Churchill had been unwell, and on his way home he came down again with pneumonia. Though recovery was rapid, it was mid-January 1944 before convalescence was complete. By May he was proposing to watch the D-Day assaults from a battlecruiser. Only the King's personal plea dissuaded him. 1939, the outbreak of the Second World War saw Neville Chamberlain resign, and Churchill become Prime Minister of an all-party wartime coalition government. Whilst he was not the popular choice amongst his own party, his resoluteness and drive impressed the general public. Churchill's energy belied his age. He was in fact already 65 years old when he became Prime Minister. During the war he suffered a few health scares, although this never deterred his determination. His mental health has since also been called into question, with many attributing clinical depression or bipolar to his intense moods whilst in office, making him an ornery person to deal with. Nevertheless, Churchill's strength was his rhetoric, which became a crucial component in the fight against Hitler's Germany, essential for morale, unity, and instilling a strong sense of leadership. On May 13, 1940, as the Germans began their offensive, he gave his first speech famously stating, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." This proved to have an exhilarating and rousing effect on Parliament, with members responding with cheers and applause. Dunkirk, the evacuation from Dunkirk. Churchill would make two further evocative speeches during the Battle of France. In June, when the Germans were overrunning territory and forcing the evacuation from Dunkirk, his rallying cry included the iconic phrase, "We shall fight on the beaches." Britain thus was prepared to stand strong in the face of German aggression. In his finest hour speech he told Parliament that he expected the Battle of Britain to occur very soon, refusing the armistice and uniting the British behind the resistance movement, strengthening unity and resolve across the British Empire. Whilst Churchill has often been respected as a great wartime leader, continually boosting morale and maintaining strong relations with the United States, the blot on his copybook was the destruction of Dresden in February 1945. The result was huge civilian casualties, including a large number of refugees. Dresden was a symbolic place. Its destruction and the way it happened has been remembered as one of Churchill's most controversial decisions. Finally, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The following day, Victory in Europe Day, was celebrated with Churchill broadcasting to the country. Whilst at Whitehall he addressed the burgeoning crowds claiming, "This is your victory." The people replied, "No, it is yours." Such was the relationship between the public and their wartime leader. In the months following victory, the National Wartime Coalition drew to a close. In the subsequent years, Churchill would end up serving as leader of the opposition, a position in which he continued to exert a great deal of influence over foreign affairs, famously in 1946 giving his Iron Curtain speech. By 1951 he had returned as Prime Minister, keen to prioritize Britain's role as an international power and involve himself in the project for a united Europe. Further afield, he was forced to confront a changing dynamic with British colonies seeking empowerment and self-rule, for example Kenya and the ensuing Mau Mau rebellion. It was becoming increasingly clear that Churchill was leading in a time when the world was changing around him. The state funeral of Sir Winston Churchill. On January 24, 1965, his ailing health got the better of him and he passed away. 6 sovereigns, 15 heads of state and some 6,000 people attended his state funeral, the first since that of the Duke of Wellington in 1852, at St. Paul's Cathedral on January 30, 1965. A man of great military might who stepped up to the plate in times of crisis and uncertainty. He was to be remembered as a rousing orator, a person who united the people of Britain in times of great adversity. He was and still is a controversial figure, but no one can dispute the enormous impact Churchill had, not just on Britain but the world. Thank you for joining us today. Please do well to subscribe to this channel so as to get more American history. Like and comment your thoughts in the comments section.